They found him just before dawn, not wandering, not lost, standing still, soaked to the bone, fur slick with rain and grit beside something too small to make sense beneath the storm. An old highway ran past that stretch of concrete, the kind people only remembered when they needed to throw something away, the kind the wind visited more than people. Cardboard, soda cans, a cracked stroller wheel, forgotten things, and now a Bassinet. It was off the shoulder, tucked into a patch of dead grass and gravel, as if someone had tried to hide it and changed their mind halfway through. Rain was falling in sheets, thick and bitter, the kind that makes grown men hesitate before stepping outside. But the dog, a large German shepherd, coat mottled with dirt and scars, had not moved in hours. Not when the night security van crept past with its headlights slicing the dark. Not when thunder cracked so hard it rattled a nearby fence post loose. Not even when the wind tore a plastic bag from the weeds and sent it flapping across the cracked road. He was still, guarding. The animal control officer, a woman named Mara, saw him first. She'd been called out for a dog loose near the service, wrote it was protocol. Sometimes it was a stray, sometimes something more tragic. She didn't expect She didn't expect the smell of milk or the warmth of breath. She didn't expect the baby. It took her a moment to realize what she was seeing. The dog didn't growl when she approached, didn't bark, didn't even blink. He simply moved closer. To the bassinet, just a fraction, just enough to make it clear, you'll have to go through me. Mara had years in the field. She had seen pit bulls used as bait, collies discarded like trash, cats drowned in sacks, but she had never seen this. The baby was wrapped in a blanket blue with little faded ducks. One edge was wet, where the rain had found its way in. His eyes were open, wide, and still. Too still. Mara knelt and reached gently inside. The child's breath came in soft, shallow flutters. A little hitch between each inhale, like he'd been crying for too long and was too tired to keep going. But he was alive, and the dog watched her the whole time, chest heaving like a bellows, every muscle strung tight as wire. Mara radioed in for backup, ambulance, shelter support, but she didn't move from the ground. She knew better than to break something sacred. The dog stepped closer to her hand. He sniffed it once, twice, then looked back at the bassinet, as if to say, "Make sure you take him. I've done all I can," and still, he didn't leave. I wasn't there that morning. I only heard about it the way most people did, through a shaky video someone took from the back of the ambulance. It made the rounds online before the facts were even clear. People love stories like that. Hero dog rescues baby. Guardian angel. Shepherd. They didn't see the part after. They didn't see what the rain left behind. I met him 2 days later. At the shelter, they were calling him Major. It was meant to sound strong, respectable, like a soldier. But he didn't seem to notice the name at all. Didn't respond when called. Didn't play. Didn't bark. Just lay curled on the mat they'd given him, head resting on paws, eyes open but not watching anything you could see. There was something in his stillness that unnerved the volunteers, not aggression. Just something that didn't fit the fluorescent lights and barking kennels. I was there to drop off blankets. I used to volunteer once a week, but after everything with Hannah, I stopped going as much. It hurt to be around creatures who still had so much fight in them. But that day, they asked if I could sit with him. "He won't eat," someone said. "We think he's shutting down." I remember the room. They'd put him in a quiet holding space with no windows, just a gray floor and walls that smelled faintly of bleach. I opened the door slowly, and he didn't move, just flicked one ear toward me. He looked bigger than he had in the video, not in size, but in presence. Like he took up more space than his body allowed. His ribs showed through in places, and the fur on one flank was matted with old blood. His eyes followed me, not suspicious, not friendly, just aware. I didn't speak right away. I just sat down on the opposite wall. Let the silence gather around us. Minutes passed. He didn't shift. I slid a little closer, slow and sideways, like you do when you're trying not to spook something wild. I didn't reach out. I didn't try to pet him. I saw the video, I said quietly, not expecting him to understand, but needing to say it out loud. You stayed. His ear twitched again. They said the baby's okay, I added, my voice rough. The hospital took him in. No sign of the mother yet. The silence stretched, thick, holding something between us I couldn't name yet. I looked at him, really looked at the grime around his eyes, the scratch above his nose, the place near his tail where the fur had come out in patches. But what struck me most wasn't what had happened to him. It was what hadn't. He hadn't run. He hadn't abandoned it. He hadn't given up, even when whoever left that child had clearly given up on everything. I swallowed hard, and for reasons I didn't fully understand, I whispered, I know what it's like to stay when no one else does. He blinked slowly, the kind of blink that feels like a breath, like the start of remembering how to feel again. I stayed with him until the shelter closed. I told them I'd come back tomorrow. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept seeing that bassinet in the rain, the outline of a dog against the storm, a child too quiet, too small, a heartbeat in the dark, and I remembered something I hadn't let myself think about in months. The way my daughter's crib looked the night the sirens came, the way I sat beside it after they took her, the way the house had echoed with nothing but my own breath, and I realized maybe I wasn't the one saving anyone. Maybe he was saving me. The next morning, I returned to the shelter before the rain had even dried from the sidewalks. The air smelled like wet pavement and something faintly metallic, as if the world itself was still exhaling from the storm. The volunteers were quieter than usual. No cheerful chatter. No teasing over who'd forgotten to rinse the feeding bowls. Just a shared heaviness, like we were all holding our breath without realizing it. I asked if Major had eaten. They shook their heads. He sniffed it once, someone said, then just turned away. Hasn't touched water either. I nodded and asked if I could sit with him again. They let me into the same small room with gray walls, a metal water bowl still full, and the same threadbare mat in the corner. He was exactly where I'd left him. I sat, cross-legged on the floor, palms resting on my knees. No words yet. Just space. Eventually, I pulled out something I hadn't planned on bringing, one of the blankets from my daughter's old nursery. Faded yellow, worn at the corners. It had lived at the back of my closet for almost 2 years, untouched, except in dreams. I laid it down gently on the floor, not too close, just near enough. His head lifted slightly, a twitch of the nose. Then, as if dragged by something older than memory, he moved 2 steps, slow and uncertain, his paws nearly silent against the linoleum. Then he settled on the blanket, like it belonged to him all along. I didn't say anything. I couldn't. My throat felt tight, but something shifted in the room. A thread tugged loose in the silence. Something is beginning to soften. And then he sighed. It was barely audible, but it felt like it echoed off the walls. Later that day, Mara, the animal control officer who had found him, came by to check in. She hadn't been able to stop thinking about him either. Said she'd barely slept, that she kept replaying that moment in the rain, the way he stood so still beside the baby. There was something in his eyes, she said. Don't panic, not fear. Just commitment. We sat together outside the kennel, sipping coffee from cracked mugs, and trying not to talk about the baby too much. It still hurts to say too much about him. He was at the hospital, stable now, but quiet. They said he hadn't made a sound since being brought in. No cooking, no crying, just breathing. They don't even know his name, Mara whispered. The nurses call him Button. Button, I repeated softly. Yeah, you know he's as small as one. No ID, no note, just left out there like he was never wanted. The thought of it made something in my chest ache. I looked through the glass window at the shepherd curled on the blanket, the same blanket I used to tuck under my daughter's chin on cold nights. He knew better, I murmured. He knew that the baby mattered. Even if whoever left him did in single quotes, Mara was quiet for a while. Then she said, "We're trying to track where he came from. No chip, no collar, no one's claimed him, but he's not wild. You can tell." I nodded slowly. He belonged to someone. Once that evening, I stayed until close again. We didn't talk much. Major and I, but I brought a brush this time. One of those soft bristle kinds they sell for older dogs. I didn't force it on him, just placed it down beside me and waited. After an hour, maybe two, he came closer. Lay beside me, not touching, but close enough to share breath. I reached out slowly, letting him see the brush in my hand. Then, with deliberate care, I touched it to the back of his neck. He flinched just slightly, but didn't move away. With every slow stroke, tufts of old, damp fur came loose. Beneath the dirt and matting, a different texture was waiting, softer than I expected, warmer, like the ghost of another life still lived beneath the surface. "You were someone's once," I said quietly. "Someone who didn't deserve you." His eyes closed, and for the first time, I saw him rest, truly resting. Not just lie still, but let go. Even just for a moment. That night, I dreamed about a house I hadn't seen in 2 years. The hallway smelled like lavender and milk. The lights were low, the hum of the baby monitor still blinking softly on the dresser. I saw the bassinet there, untouched, and then, by its side, a dog. Not Major, not exactly, but close, his ears perked, toward the door, watching, waiting. I reached out and woke with tears on my cheeks. By the 4th day, the staff had begun to accept that I was coming back. Every morning, every afternoon, he lets you near him, they said. "You've got a magic touch." It wasn't magic. It was a memory. It was grief, recognizing grief. That afternoon, I brought a small scrap of roast chicken in a napkin, just a bite. He didn't touch it right away, but after I set it near the blanket and stepped back, I watched him sniff it, lick it once. Then, slowly, quietly, he ate. It was the first thing he'd eaten since arriving, and I knew then something had broken open inside him, a crack wide enough for something like hope to creep in. They asked me if I wanted to foster. "Just short term," the director said. "He needs quiet, familiarity, someone he trusts." I hesitated. I hadn't let myself take care of anything since Hannah. Not even a plant. Not a goldfish. Nothing that needed me. But when I looked into his eyes that night and saw the question already waiting, I understood that I didn't need to be ready. I just needed to say yes. I brought him home in the back seat of my old sedan. The shelter gave me a leash, but he didn't pull, didn't strain. He walked beside me like we'd done it 100 times. At home, I laid the yellow blanket in the corner of the living room. He patted over, sniffed it once, and settled down like he belonged there. I sat nearby, hands folded in my lap. Neither of us spoke, but the silence between us felt full, like something beginning again. That night, as the rain returned and tapped softly against the windows, I fell asleep on the couch, the soft rhythm of his breath in the dark, like a lullaby I hadn't known I needed. The first morning with him at home was quiet, in a way I hadn't experienced in years. The house had long ago adjusted to silence, not the peaceful kind, but the hollow sort that clings to empty rooms. Since Hannah, I'd left things untouched. Her tiny shoes still lined up near the door, her lamp with the sheep-shaped base still glowing faintly in the hallway at night, a ghost of routine preserved in porcelain and fabric and shadows. But now, silence felt different, not empty, expectant. I found him curled in the same spot where I'd left the blanket. He hadn't moved during the night, at least not that I could tell, but when I stepped into the room and called softly, "Hey boy." He lifted his head, ears twitching, eyes already awake, no tail wag, no bark, but he stood, and he followed. I moved through my morning carefully, not wanting to jolt whatever fragile trust had formed. I didn't speak much, only when needed. I brewed tea instead of coffee. The smell was gentler, less sharp. I let the kettle hiss before lifting it away from the heat. He watched from a distance, not hiding, but not close. When I opened the door, to the backyard, just a small fenced patch of grass and old rose bushes. Gone wild, he didn't bolt. He stepped through the door, paused to sniff the air, then sat at the edge of the deck, watching the wind. I stood behind him for a while, arms wrapped around myself. The wind carried the smell of damp leaves, dew, and something distant, smoke, maybe, or memory. I wondered what it smelled like to him, what parts of his story still clung to the soil beneath his paws. Around noon, he surprised me. I'd left the back door open and was folding laundry upstairs. The sunlight was pouring in through the half-closed blinds, warm and soft, falling across the hardwood like honey. And then I heard it, not barking, not whimpering, just the sound of his paws on the stairs, slow, hesitant. I turned, and there he was, standing in the hallway just outside Hannah's room. The door was cracked open, as it always had been. I froze, my hand clutched the edge of a towel, the fabric trembling in my grip. He stepped closer, paused at the threshold. His nose lifted, slightly, inhaled. I wanted to stop him, but I didn't. He walked into the room, slow and quiet, as if respecting something sacred. And then he did something that nearly brought me to my knees. He sat down in front of the crib, just sat, ears up, eyes forward, like he'd done it before, like it was instinct, like he knew. I sank onto the edge of the bed, unable to breathe for a moment. The afternoon light streamed in across the faded wallpaper, dust motes spinning lazily in the air. He didn't move, just stared at that crib like it held something invisible. Or remembered. Maybe it did. I didn't cry. Not then. Instead, I whispered, "She would have loved you." And somewhere deep inside me, something cracked. Not painfully, but gently. Like the first thaw, after a long freeze. Over the next few days, he began to map the house, as if he were rediscovering something once familiar. He traced the hallways in slow loops, paused at corners, sniffed under chairs, and behind doors. There was one moment, just a second, where I watched him stop near the front entryway. He stared at a set of scuff marks on the lower half of the wall. Places where Hannah had once kicked off her shoes or thrown her toys. He stared long enough that I found myself holding my breath. Then he moved on. But I didn't. At the shelter, they continued to search for any information. Flyers had gone out. Social services still hadn't found the baby's parents. The case was officially under investigation, abandonment charges likely pending. If anyone was ever found, they sent me updates about the baby now and then. He was doing better. Still quiet, but his vitals were strong. Nurses had taken to holding him constantly. They said he calmed easiest when wrapped in fleece. One of the nurses told me she played lullabies on her phone during late shifts, and he would turn his head toward the sound, not cry, not smile, just listen. He's like a little ghost, she said, like he's waiting for something he hasn't recognized yet. I didn't tell her what I was starting to wonder. Maybe he was waiting for the dog. On the 5th night, the shepherd did something I hadn't seen him do before. He whimpered Ed just once. In his sleep, it was soft, barely a sound, but it woke me. I sat up on the couch, blanket tangled at my feet, and watched him. He was curled beside the yellow blanket again, legs twitching faintly. A small tremor ran through his hind leg, a whine caught in his throat, cut short. Then silence. I wanted to go to him, to lay a hand on his back, to tell him he was safe, but I waited, and when his eyes opened glassy, confused, I simply whispered, "You're home." The next day, I did something I hadn't done in months. I drove, not for groceries or appointments, not because I had to, but because I needed to retrace something. He sat in the passenger seat, calm, unmoving. The leash lay coiled in my lap, unused. I took the old roads, not the main highway, but the back routes that wound between forgotten fields and rusted fences. Roads that smelled like smoke in winter and wildflowers in spring, and eventually, I found it, the stretch of gravel shoulder, the overgrown patch of grass, the place where the bassinet had been. I pulled over. We sat for a long time, engine off, windows cracked just enough to let in the breath of the breeze. He stared at the spot, not with panic, not even sadness, just stillness. I followed his gaze. The grass had bent where something heavy once lay. A faint imprint of structure still clung to the soil. Empty now, gone, but not forgotten, I whispered. You didn't leave him. And maybe I was speaking to him, or maybe to myself. That night, I printed a photo from the shelter of the one someone had taken of him standing guard beside the bassinet in the rain. I framed it and set it in the hallway, just outside Hannah's room, a quiet monument to two children, one lost, one found, and a dog who had loved both in his own way. The phone call came late on a Thursday afternoon. The sky outside had turned that pale gray that always reminded me of linen sheets left on the line too long. I was sitting on the back porch, a lukewarm mug of tea in my hands, while the shepherd lay at my feet, his head resting on the worn wood, ears gently rising and falling with each passing breeze. He hadn't needed the leash in days, hadn't tested the gate or the boundaries, just followed me wherever I moved like a breath tethered to mine. The phone buzzed once, then again. I let it go to voicemail, but a minute later, it rang once more. This time, I answered. The voice on the other end was soft, a nurse, from the children's ward. She hesitated before speaking as if she didn't quite know how to begin. I know this is an unusual request, she said, but would you consider bringing the dog to the hospital? I didn't answer at first. She continued gently. The baby's health is stable. Physically he's doing fine, but emotionally he's not responding to anything. He won't eat when anyone's around. He stares at the walls. Sometimes rocks himself in the crib. I closed my eyes. Then she added, but this morning, one of the doctors played that video, one of your dogs, standing in the rain. We didn't even show it to the baby, just had it playing in the background. And for the first time he turned toward the sound. Silence swelled between us. Then, almost shyly, she said, he reached for the screen. I didn't make a decision right away. After the call, I sat for a long while on the porch, watching the sky change, listening to the wind comb through the trees. The shepherd nudged his nose against my knee, then lay back down. Something inside me was afraid of opening a door that couldn't be closed again, afraid that bringing him back into that world would undo everything we'd started to rebuild. But I also knew some threads pull for a reason. The next morning, I dressed carefully, not for show, just for presence. A cardigan that still smelled faintly of lavender, soft shoes that wouldn't echo on hospital floors. I packed a towel in my bag not because I needed it, but because it used to be Hannah's. It had a small embroidered star in one corner. Familiar things carry weight. I didn't know why I felt I might need it. At the shelter, they had me sign a few forms. Nothing legal, just permissions for therapy, visitation. Mara met me in the parking lot. He's ready, she asked, nodding toward the dog. He's already in the car, I said. I didn't even need to call him. The children's ward was on the 3rd floor, a quiet wing with seafoam green walls and murals of clouds drifting above wooden cribs. It didn't smell like bleach, not exactly, more like plastic, and hand soap and something underneath that reminded me of warmed milk. A nurse met us at the elevator. She was young, freckles across her nose, and she moved with that careful energy people use around pain they don't fully understand. She led us down the hallway, her voice barely above a whisper. "He's been awake most nights," she said. "Don't cry. Doesn't make a sound. But we keep finding him sitting upright, clutching the edge of the crib." I glanced down at the shepherd walking beside me. His posture had changed. Eyes forward, head low, tail still. He knew. The room was dim when we entered. Soft amber lighting filtered through the blinds. The crib sat near the window, a folded blanket at one corner. The baby was awake, small and pale, his dark eyes watching the wall like it might tell him something he hadn't yet understood. He didn't move when we entered, not until the shepherd stopped at the threshold. Then, quietly, without sound, the baby turned, eyes locked. Something passed between them I couldn't name. Not recognition, not relief, something older, like memories, or a promise. The shepherd took a step forward. The baby reached out just once, tiny fingers trembling in the air, and the shepherd lay down, right there, beside the crib, as if he had never left. The nurses didn't speak. One of them wiped her eyes quietly and stepped out of the room. The door whispered shut behind her. I stayed. For the next hour, the baby didn't make a sound, but he didn't look away, not once. His fingers gripped the wooden rail of the crib. His chest rose and fell slowly. The shepherd never blinked. I pulled a chair close and sat, not wanting to intrude on whatever was unfolding. Eventually, the baby shifted. His hand dropped down between the slats of the crib, fingers brushing the space between the wood and the floor. The shepherd inched closer and let his nose rest against those fingers. No barking, no wagging, just breathe. That night, I was allowed to stay in the observation room. They gave me a cot. I didn't use it. I sat in the corner and watched as the baby finally drifted to sleep, his fist wrapped around the shepherd's ear, still clutching like he feared the dog might vanish again. He did until dawn. The next morning, the nurse returned with gentle words. "We've never seen him this calm," she said. "He's still silent, but it's different now, like he's listening." The shepherd was quiet all day. He moved only to drink when offered a bowl, then returned to the baby's side. At one point, the baby made a sound, not quite a cry, more like a soft hiccup, a startled breath. The shepherd lifted his head, and the baby smiled. It wasn't wide, it wasn't bright, but it was there, and for a child who hadn't smiled since the night someone placed him in a bassinet beside the road, it was everything. That evening, the hospital let me hold the baby. It felt unreal, his weight so light, the warmth of him radiating through the blanket. He looked up at me, with eyes still wary, still unsure. But when the shepherd nudged his nose against my leg, something shifted. The baby leaned his tiny head against my chest, and exhaled, not in fear, not in pain, but in rest. Back home that night, the shepherd stood at the edge of the porch and stared into the dark. I stood beside him, arms folded. "Was he yours?" I asked. He didn't answer, but his ears tilted toward me, and I realized something I hadn't allowed myself to believe before. Whether or not the baby had belonged to him before, he belonged to him now. By the end of that week, they let us bring the baby home. It was meant to be a temporary placement, a gesture of continuity. The nurses had their concerns, of course. They spoke gently, with measured eyes and cautious optimism. But there was something they couldn't explain, something they kept returning to. He only eats when the dog is near. He only sleeps if the shepherd is in the room. He only smiles when you carry him. It wasn't about custody or paperwork yet. It was about comfort, about keeping a child alive, not just breathing, but held together in the soft rhythm of something familiar. So they handed him to me wrapped in a new blanket, green with a pattern of tiny stars. His eyes were heavy, his lashes damp. He clutched the shepherd's ear with one hand as we stepped out into the daylight. The dog walked beside us like he'd always been meant to. Bringing him home was like breathing into a room I'd sealed off for years. I cleared the corner of the living room, where the old rocking chair still sat, dusted the baseboards, pulled the crib down from the attic, slow and trembling. Each part heavier than I remembered. I hadn't thought I'd ever put it together again, but I did, piece by piece, wood on wood, screw by screw. The shepherd lay nearby the whole time, not watching exactly, is more like guarding the space. When the crib was done, I placed the same yellow blanket inside the one the dog had claimed on his first night here, and when I gently laid the baby down, his eyes fluttered. His breath caught once, then he sighed, and slept. The first few days were a blur of small rituals. The feeding bottles warmed just right, diapers changed in silence, walking around the house, with the baby tucked in close against my shoulder, his hand always curled near the fabric of my collar. The shepherd moved in tandem, never more than a few steps away, sleeping at the foot of the crib, rising with me in the night, pacing near the door when the baby whimpered, even before I heard it. They had a rhythm I didn't fully understand, one that didn't need words. Sometimes the baby would lift his arm mid-ream, reaching into the air, and the dog would sit upright, alert, watching the room, as if something unseen had entered. There was no barking, no growling, just presence, the kind that makes shadows step back. I began to speak more, quietly, mostly to myself, but sometimes to them both, narrating small things, naming objects, repeating sounds. I didn't expect the baby to reply, but once, as I held a soft rattle in front of him, his eyes found mine, and though his lips didn't part, he made a noise low and uncertain, more breath than sound. The shepherd perked up, immediately, and something lit inside me I hadn't felt in years. Hope, maybe? Or something older like recognition. On the fourth morning, I found the shepherd curled beside the crib with the baby's hand pressed against his nose. They were both asleep. The light was pouring in through the window, soft and golden, painting the room in silence. I stood in the doorway and didn't move, not for fear of waking them, but because I didn't want to disturb what had settled. For the first time since Hannah's absence, I felt something other than grief in that room. Not joy, exactly, but belonging. The baby still hadn't made a full sound. No babbling, no cries, just those small breaths, the tiny motions of fingers clutching air or fabric. But he began to hum, not music, just a single note rhythm, a vibration in his chest, soft and sustained. It came most often when he was being held, or when the shepherd lay beside him. He would press his forehead gently to the dog's side, and hum. The dog, in return, would lift his head and exhale through his nose a warm rush of breath across the baby's skin. They were speaking, in their own language. Sometimes, late at night, I would sit on the porch with a mug of tea growing cold in my hands, watching the baby sleep through the monitor. The shepherd would sit beside me, upright and still. I found myself telling him things I hadn't said aloud in years. Not secrets, just truths. Pieces of memory I'd tucked into drawers and closets and sealed behind doors. I used to think grief was the end, I whispered one night, like it was the thing that would close me off forever. The shepherd didn't move, but I saw the flicker in his ear. I didn't know it could hold space for something else. A pause. Then I asked what I hadn't dared speak aloud before. Was he yours? That baby? The dog shifted then. Just a slow turning of his head. His eyes met mine, and in that stillness, I understood something without needing proof. It didn't matter, because he'd made the child his, by staying, by refusing to run, by choosing not to forget. The next afternoon, a woman from social services came by, not with questions, but with gentle steps and a clipboard held loosely in her arms. She introduced herself quietly and didn't ask about the nursery. She saw the crib, the toys, the bottle station beside the sink, the soft circles beneath my eyes. She watched the shepherd rise when the baby stirred. She said she wasn't here to make judgments, just to listen. We spoke about routines, about care, about names. I didn't have one for the baby yet, not one that belonged to him. They had given him a temporary one at the hospital, Jonah, she said, though it wasn't official. I held the baby in my arms, rocking him gently. Jonah, I repeated. The shepherd's ear twitched, and the baby's hand reached for the dog's fur. That was enough for now. That night, for the first time, I sang a lullaby I hadn't heard since Hannah's last night at home. One she used to drift off to while clutching my finger, her breath catching every time I paused. My voice cracked on the second verse, but I kept singing, and the baby hummed, and the dog stayed, until the song ended, and the quiet returned, and sleep found all three of us together in the same room. There was a shift that week, subtle at first, like the light changing in a room before you've had a chance to notice the sun has moved. Neighbors began to linger longer near the fence. Strangers began to pause on the sidewalk when we walked past the shepherd on one side of the stroller, silent as ever, his head always turned slightly toward the child. People looked not with judgment, but with quiet curiosity. I started to recognize the pattern: a nod, a glance, then the question, "Is that the dog from the news?" Sometimes I would nod, sometimes I would say yes, but I never offered more than that, because it wasn't a story I could give away. On the 7th morning after the baby had come home, I found a letter slipped under the front door. No stamp, no envelope, just a folded note, written in delicate, slightly crooked handwriting. I saw him in the rain. I didn't know what to do. I still don't. There was no name, no address, no signature, just that, and a faint scent of perfume on the paper, lavender and smoke. I stared at it for a long time, and then, without telling anyone, I tucked it into a drawer beside my bed. That day, I watched the baby crawl for the first time. It wasn't fast, more of a dragon paw, his arms stronger than his legs, his head bobbing slightly with each determined movement. He crossed the living room floor like it mattered, like he was going somewhere he'd always meant to return to. The shepherd was lying near the back door, half asleep, but when he heard the sound of the baby's palms slapping softly on the floorboards, he opened one eye. The baby paused a few feet away, lifted his head, then, with the smallest of grins, reached out and pressed his hand to the dog's paw. Not tentative, not testing, like a greeting, not like a beginning. Later that evening, I told Mara about the note. I wasn't sure why. Maybe I just needed someone else to hold it with me. The knowledge that someone out there was watching, that someone hadn't forgotten. Her face changed when I read it aloud. Not fear, not anger, just something cautious behind the eyes. "You think it was the mother?" she asked quietly. "I don't know." She folded her arms and leaned against the porch railing. The late sun made her badge glint beneath her coat. "Well," she said, "if she's still close, she hasn't tried to take him back. That has to mean something." I nodded slowly, but the truth was, I wasn't sure what it meant, only that it stirred something uncertain in my chest. A thread pulled loose, barely noticed, but once pulled, never quite able to be tucked back in. That night, the baby refused to sleep. He wasn't fussy, he wasn't crying, just restless. Wide-eyed, shifting, I carried him through the house, past the kitchen, down the hallway, past the door I still hadn't opened since the day I brought down the crib, Hannah's room. The baby turned his head toward it. I kept walking. He pressed his ear against my shoulder and made that soft hum again, the one he always made when he was between waking and sleep. And somewhere in that low, broken sound, I thought I heard a second voice. Not a word, just "breathe," echoed. I turned. The shepherd was there, standing in the doorway to Hannah's room, watching. I stepped closer, not fully knowing why. The door creaked open. Inside, the dust was thinner than I expected. The air held that faint sweetness, old paper and lavender powder. The toys were still arranged on the shelf. The mobile above the bed hung motionless in the still air. I stepped in, The shepherd entered behind me and lay down at the foot of the crib. He didn't look at me, just curled into the same position I had seen him take that first day, alert, yet restful. The baby, against my shoulder, went still, and then I felt it loosening in his breath. The surrender to sleep. I sat in the rocking chair, let it sway once, twice, and somewhere between those movements, I felt it again. Not peace, exactly, but permission. The next morning, a woman knocked on my door. She wore a long brown coat and soft shoes. Her hair was pulled back into a bun so tight it made her face look too young. She carried a clipboard. "Child welfare," she said, her voice calm, practiced. "I'm here for the weekly check-in." I let her in. She didn't ask many questions. Instead, she observed. She watched how the baby's eyes tracked the shepherd as he walked through the room, how his fingers curled around fur, how his breath stayed. Even she took note of the routines I'd written on the calendar: bottle times, nap windows, doctor appointments, and she paused at the photograph on the hallway wall, the one of the shepherd in the rain beside the Bassinet. "You were the one who took him in." "I didn't mean to," I said softly. She didn't respond, just wrote something down at the end of her visit. She glanced toward the door and then back at me. "There's been no claim filed," she said. "No family stepping forward. If things stay this way, you may be eligible to begin the guardianship process soon." I nodded, but I felt the words slip past like smoke. Soon. Later that week, a second note arrived, this time tucked into the garden gate. "Does he still hum?" No name, no return address, only that, written in the same hand. The same soft curve and the lowercase e's. I stared at it until the sun set, until the shadows made it unreadable. Then I folded it slowly, pressed it into the same drawer, and went to sit by the crib. The baby had fallen asleep with one hand tucked against the shepherd's flank. The hum had stopped, but the echo remained. In this way, the dog's breathing matched the rise and fall of the child's chest. In the way my own heartbeat softened in the quiet. In this way memory filled the space where words had once lived. It was during the second week of spring that the silence began to shift. Not in the child, he remained wordless, clinging to the rhythm of humming and gaze, speaking only in the touch of fingers to fur, in the breathy sound he made when dreaming beside the dog. No, the change came in the atmosphere between us. Something had begun to surface, not loud, not clear, but present. It was in the way the baby hesitated at the threshold of Hannah's room, even when I carried him there for naps. In the way the shepherd watched the front windows now, more than he used to, his ears angled toward the street at night, his body tense when headlights passed too slow or stopped too long. It was in me, too, a heaviness beneath the ribs, a sense of time bending inward. I had begun to expect another note, and when it arrived, this time folded inside a baby sock left on the porch step, I wasn't surprised. He liked lullabies, especially the ones without words. He would fall asleep, with his fingers in the dog's ear. The handwriting hadn't changed, but the tone had. This wasn't guilt. It was grief. There was no demand, no plea, just memory. The sock was worn a pale blue, fraying slightly at the heel. I ran my thumb over the fabric and tried to imagine her, the woman who had carried him, the one who had left him. She had loved him. I know that now. Not because of what she'd written, but because of what she hadn't asked for. She hadn't asked for him back. She was watching, but not approaching. And that told me everything. The baby was changing. Too, he no longer whimpered in sleep. He had begun reaching for objects, now the corners of blankets, the edge of the carpet, the tags on pillows. Small things, meaningless, unless you knew what it meant for a child who had once been frozen in stillness. He liked holding the shepherd's leash, not walking him, just holding it, letting the rough leather drag between his fingers, while the dog sat nearby, as patient as the earth. Sometimes I wondered if they remembered something together. Not an image, not a place, but a feeling. A season of their lives where love had not yet frayed at the edges. One afternoon, the baby was sitting on a rug in the living room, surrounded by soft blocks. He wasn't stacking them, just touching, turning them over, testing the weight. The shepherd lay beside him, one paw crossed over the other. I sat in the rocker, letting the stillness settle, and then, without warning, the baby turned and looked up at the dog and let out a sound, not a hum, not a cry, just a single, open syllable. Ba. I froze. The shepherd lifted his head. The baby blinked, then reached out and touched the dog's nose with the palm of his hand, as if he had summoned him. My breath caught, and I let it go too fast. I whispered, "Was that his first word?" The baby didn't repeat it, but he looked up at me, his eyes calm, and then returned his gaze to the shepherd. That night, I didn't sleep. Not because the baby stirred, he slept deeper now than he ever had, but because I kept thinking about what it meant. How language returns, how memory, when buried, doesn't vanish, it waits. And if he was starting to remember, would it bring healing, or heartbreak? Would his first full sentence be one of presence, or absence? I stepped into the hallway and watched through the cracked door as the dog lifted his head at the sound of my footsteps, then laid it back down beside the crib, guarding still. 3 days later, Mara came by. She brought new dog food and a squeaky toy shaped like a duck. The shepherd sniffed it once, then ignored it entirely. We laughed quietly. "You know," she said, sipping tea on the porch, "this isn't normal, I know." She didn't mean it unkindly, but she looked tired, heavier somehow. She pulled a folded sheet of paper from her coat pocket. "It's about the mother," she said, "the one leaving the notes." My chest tightened. Someone saw her yesterday, near the hospital. She was sitting on the bench outside the pediatric wing, just watching. Didn't go inside. Security tried to ask her some questions, but she left before they could get close. I nodded slowly. "She hasn't broken any laws," Mara added. "Not yet, but she's afraid," I said. Maybe we were quiet for a while. Then Mara said something I hadn't expected. She might love him, just not in the way he needs. That night I found the baby standing in his crib. He wasn't calling out, just standing, his hands gripping the rail, eyes wide open. Focused on the window, I followed his gaze. There was nothing out there, only the dark. The street lamp casting shadows against the far fence. But the shepherd was already up, standing at the foot of the crib, his body tense. I stepped to the window and looked again, and then I saw it. A figure at the edge of the property, far back, near the tree line. Still, watching, she didn't move when I turned on the porch light. Didn't approach, just stood there for a moment longer, then stepped backward, into the dark. The next day, the social worker returned. She brought more papers, spoke gently. "I need you to think about permanence," she said. "If you want to begin the legal process, it's time." I nodded, but my mind was elsewhere. Not because I was uncertain about loving this child, I already did. Not because I doubted my home had become theirs as much as mine, but because love had never been the problem. The problem was what love left behind. That night, I wrote a note. For her. I didn't sign it. I didn't address it. Just 3 lines. He hums when he sleeps. He reaches for the dog's ear. He is safe. I folded it. I walked out into the yard and left it at the edge of the tree line. By morning, it was gone, but something had stayed behind. A single sock. This one is red. Newer, unworn. A quiet reply. Thank you. Maybe or a goodbye. I didn't tell anyone about the red sock. Not Mara, not the social worker, not even the dog. It sat quietly in my dresser drawer, beside the other notes folded gently, tucked away among things I hadn't touched in years. Old earrings. A music box with a cracked lid. A single photograph of Hannah the morning before the sirens came. I wasn't sure why. I kept them together. Only that part of me knew grief and love were not opposites. Sometimes they shared the same drawer. Spring pressed deeper into the edges of the days. The garden, long neglected, began to bud in places I hadn't planted. Wild things. Things with no name. But their color was soft, and their scent faint and full of memory drifted through the open kitchen windows in the afternoons. The baby had begun to crawl faster, more certain, less hesitant. He could cross the living room now in a matter of seconds. Always toward the dog. Always toward the same spot at the edge of the rug, where the shepherd often lay stretched out, head on paws, eyes following each movement, like a quiet guardian. The bond between them had deepened into something sacred. The kind of silence that speaks, and yet the world outside our little rhythm had begun to shift. Paperwork, evaluations, a court date is scheduled. A social worker's questions, growing less casual. Do you see this as a long-term commitment? Are you prepared to testify if the biological parent reappears? Do you feel the child is thriving in your care? Yes, yes, yes. But every answer was tangled with another truth I hadn't yet voiced. I wasn't just caring for them. They were rebuilding me. I caught Mara watching me during one of her visits. The baby had fallen asleep in the rocker with me, his hand curled in the fold of my shirt. The shepherd dozed at my feet, the tips of his ears twitching now and then like he was chasing something distant. You're different now, she said quietly. How so? She gave a soft smile. You're breathing again. I didn't know how to answer. She stood, walked to the window, and tapped her finger gently against the glass. They're not just healing because of you. They're healing with you. That evening, I brought out Hannah's old baby book. It had been years since I'd opened it. The pages still smelled faintly of talcum powder and the lavender sachets my mother used to tuck into drawers. Each page had soft pastel borders, firsts, measurements, milestones, but also scribbled notes. I'd made little things only I would remember. March 18th, first time she laughed in her sleep. April 3rd held my finger like she thought it would float away. May 12th slept beside the dog for the first time. Never looked so safe. That one stopped me. I traced the words with my thumb, heart tight in my chest. Safe. I glanced across the room at the child sleeping soundly on the floor mat, his hand resting lightly on the shepherd's back, and I knew what I had to do. The next morning, I called the social worker and said I was ready. Not for temporary care, not for waiting, but for permanence. She didn't respond right away, then said, softly, okay? We'll move forward. But I could hear something in her voice. A pause. She didn't explain. I didn't ask. Some silences need space. 2 days later, the knock came. Not a stranger. Not a uniform. Just a woman. Thin, pale, with tired eyes, and a cardigan that looked too large for her shoulders. She stood at the bottom step, with her arms wrapped around herself like the wind might carry her off. She didn't ask to come inside. I stepped out onto the porch. She looked up. Her face held no defiance. Only an ache I had seen in the mirror too many times to misread. I won't take him, she said before I could speak. I waited. I just needed to see what safe looked like. We stood, in silence. Then she added, I knew the dog would stay. He was always like that. Loyal to a fault. Her voice broke slightly. I studied her face. There were shadows beneath her eyes, but no hardness. She had been someone, once. Someone trying, and now she was someone letting go. Did you love him? I asked. She nodded slowly. Yes. But I wasn't strong enough to keep him safe. I knew I wasn't. I didn't want to leave him in a dumpster. I didn't want to leave him at all. But I knew the dog wouldn't walk away. She looked past me then, toward the window where the shepherd sat, watching. He guarded him like he had guarded me. I swallowed hard. She pulled a folded envelope from her coat and held it out. I wrote everything down. His name, the story, my consent. I'm not running anymore. I took the envelope with trembling hands. She turned, without waiting for my reply, and began to walk away. I didn't stop her, because some departures aren't abandonment, they're mercy. That night, I read the letter after the baby had fallen asleep. His name was Leo. He had been born premature. The dog's name had once been Keeper. They had lived in a shelter, moved town to town. His father had been violent. The mother Grace had run when it became too much. She had tried to build a life in secret, but fear kept finding her, and when the money ran out, she left him where she thought hope might find him. I didn't choose the rain, she wrote, but I chose the dog, because I knew he would choose him. I didn't cry until the last line. If he grows up knowing love, then I did one thing right. The following morning, I sat with the shepherd on the porch. The sun was rising soft and orange, slipping through the early fog like a promise. I leaned against the railing and whispered, "You kept your promise, didn't you?" The dog didn't move, just lifted his eyes to meet mine. And in that stillness, I understood that we had all made promises we hadn't spoken aloud, and we had kept them, in silence, in loyalty, in love. The paperwork arrived on a Monday morning. A thick manila envelope slid through the slot and landed on the floor with the soft weight of permanence. I stood there a moment before picking it up, listening to the shepherd's paws clicking quietly across the hall as he came to my side, as if he too could feel the change settling into the walls. I opened it at the kitchen table. The baby Leo, I reminded myself now, was sitting in the high chair, slowly squeezing mashed banana between his fingers, with the same seriousness as a scholar turning pages. The shepherd sat beneath him, patient and still, catching the stray pieces that tumbled from above. Inside the envelope were forms of official ones, social worker notes, statements of intent, the first draft of the guardianship agreement. My name is printed alongside his, in black ink. In full, there was a line I hadn't been prepared for. Legal name requested for the child, and then a blank line. I stared at it longer than anything else. Leo, it was the name she gave him. It belonged to her grief, and her hope, and her surrender, but now it belonged to his future. Later that day, I carried him upstairs for his nap. We passed the old photograph of Hannah on the stairwell wall, the one where she was holding a plastic watering can upside down, grinning with her whole face. The baby leaned toward it, one chubby finger extended toward her image. "Ah," he said softly, a sound, not a word, but it felt like acknowledgement. I pressed a kiss to his temple and whispered, "You would have liked her." In the nursery, I laid him gently in the crib. The shepherd circled once at the foot and settled. It had become a ritual now, the three of us in quiet formation, like something sacred stitched into a moment. We all knew how to share. He hummed softly as he drifted. The shepherd sighed, and I sat beside the crib, pen in hand, the envelope on my lap. On that blank line, I wrote, Leo Thomas Ainsley. Leo, for the child she loved. Thomas, after my grandfather, a man who once told me, names are anchors. Don't give one lightly. And Ainsley mine, not to erase the past, but to give it a place to grow. The next morning, I called the social worker and gave her the name. She paused a beat, then said, "That's a good name. A quiet one." I thought so too. "You'll need to come in and finalize next week. There's a hearing. I'll be there." She hesitated again, then asked, "Would you be open to writing a letter for the mother? Something we can hold on file, in case she ever wants to read it?" I didn't speak at first, not because I didn't know what to say, but because I already knew too much. Then I replied, "Yes, I'll write her something," and I meant it. That night, the rain came back. Not a storm, just a soft, steady fall, the kind that hushes everything beneath it. I sat on the porch with the shepherd beside me, the baby sleeping soundly inside, the monitor resting on my lap like a fragile window into peace. I thought about Grace, where she was now, what weight she still carried, whether she'd ever walk past the tree line again, or if the red sock had been her final offering. I took out a sheet of paper and began to write. Dear Grace, he is still humming. He sleeps deeply now, curled beside the dog, the one you trusted when you couldn't trust yourself anymore. I don't know what you see when you close your eyes at night, but I hope that somewhere in that darkness, there's light, a moment of stillness, knowing that you didn't abandon him. You gave him a chance. He's growing. Every day, something new. Today, he pointed to my tea mug and said, Bah. I don't know what he meant, but I celebrated anyway. Some sounds are more than words. I want you to know you are not forgotten. I keep your notes in a drawer beside his birth sock. I will tell him, one day, about the woman who walked away, not out of failure, but out of love, twisted by fear. I will tell him about the rain, about the shepherd who stayed, about the kind of courage it takes to give someone else the chance to do what you wish you could have. His name is Leo. You gave him that. I added the rest. But your name is stitched into his story. It always will be. You did one thing right. Maybe more than one. Thank you. Ainsley. I folded the letter, placed it in a blank envelope, slid it into the file folder beside the court papers. Some things don't need to be delivered to be received. The days that followed grew warmer. Leo began standing on his own more often, letting go of furniture, wobbling, grinning, tumbling, then trying again. Every time, the shepherd would rise to his feet and walk over, not to stop him, but to bear witness. The dog's presence was not corrected. It was encouragement, a silent reassurance that falling did not mean failure. One morning, Leo took 3 steps toward the shepherd, fell, laughed, and then said it. Clear as light. Keepa. The dog lifted his head, ears high. Leo repeated it. Keeper, not a name I had spoken in his presence. Not once, but something had remained. The shepherd stood. I walked toward him and sat. Leo reached forward, one hand on the fur, one fist on the floor, and smiled. That night, I moved the photograph in the hallway. Hannah's smile beside Leo's first steps. 2 frames. 2 stories. 1 home. The week leading up to the hearing was quiet. No new letters. No sightings at the tree line. No change in our rhythm. But something in me had changed. Not an ending. Not a conclusion. Just a readiness. The morning of the court date, I dressed Leo in a simple white sweater with tiny buttons up the side. He sucked his thumb the entire time I fastened them, blinking up at me with those wide, calm eyes. The shepherd walked beside us into the courthouse, permitted by the judge's special order. Therapy dog status, emotional support. No one questioned it. Inside the courtroom, it was quiet. Just a few voices. Soft papers shuffled. Leo clutching my necklace. The dog curled beside the bench, like he'd been born in solemn halls. I spoke when asked, signed when prompted. I held my breath when the judge read the name aloud, Leo Thomas Ainsley, and when the gavel struck a gentle tap, not a slam, Leo pressed his forehead to my shoulder and exhaled outside. The wind was warm. Mara met us on the steps, hands tucked in her jacket. She didn't speak, just placed her hand over mine, then leaned down and whispered to the dog, You did good, keeper. He blinked once and stayed still. That evening, we returned home. Leo crawled into my lap. The dog curled at our feet. I reached for the lullaby, the one I hadn't sung since Hannah, and let the words rise gently into the room. And as I sang, Leo hummed, not out of fear, not out of need, but because it was his now, this song, this place, this name. And we stayed there, the 3 of us, until the last note faded into night. The morning after the hearing, the world felt quieter. Not empty, just full, in a different way. There were no letters at the gate, no new socks, no watching figures beyond the trees. Only the hum of the wind through the branches and the golden sprawl of light over the porch floorboards. Leo woke slowly, nestled against my shoulder, his tiny breaths puffing soft clouds into the cotton of my robe. When I carried him downstairs, the shepherd followed at a careful pace, as he always did his steps, even deliberately, like he knew that his job hadn't ended when the papers were signed. If anything, it had just begun. That day, I opened Hannah's room again, not because I needed to, but because it was time to stop guarding the threshold like a wound. I moved gently, not changing the room completely, not erasing, just shifting, softening, making space. The rocking chair remained, the bookshelf, the faded wallpaper, with tiny stars. But I added a second blanket to the crib, one that belonged to Leo, pale green, stitched with quiet constellations. And beside the bed, I placed a small photograph, not me, not Hannah Dodd of the dog and the baby, taken the day before Leo's arms wrapped around Keeper's neck, both of them mid-blink, mid-breath. It had captured a moment I hadn't known how to name until then. Trust, the kind that is neither earned nor given, only lived. That afternoon, I walked the garden path behind the house. Leo toddled ahead of me, his chubby hands outstretched like wings, catching wind and falling petals. The dog walked behind him, steady, a silent shadow. I knelt beside a patch of lavender, overgrown and wild. It was one of the last things Hannah had planted with me, or rather, thrown into the dirt with great conviction and no patience, and then promptly forgotten. But it has returned every spring since, persistent, rooted. I plucked a small bloom and tucked it into the baby's sweater. He didn't react, just leaned into my chest, the scent trailing between us like a forgotten lullaby. By sunset, the light had turned to honey. We sat on the porch again, all three of us in the old chair, Leo curled in my lap. Keeper stretched beside us with his chin resting on one paw. A hush settled over the yard, birds folding into nests, shadows lengthening across the grass. I spoke, without thinking. To think it all started with a bassinet in the rain. The words weren't meant for anyone, but the dog's ears twitched, and Leo looked up at me. He didn't speak yet, but his gaze held something older than words. Understanding, I brushed his hair back and smiled. You've come far, little lion. The next morning, I lit a candle. For Hannah. For Grace. For all the names that had not made it into court documents, but were etched somewhere deeper in breath, in bone. In the corners of photographs not hung, Leo watched the flame flicker, reached toward it with his curious hand. I gently caught his fingers and whispered, not to touch, only to remember. He hummed softly and pressed his face against my shoulder. The dog sat near the doorway, eyes following us, and I realized this was the family photograph we would never take, but would always carry. A child held a dog watching, a woman remembering how to live. Again, later that week, we visited the shelter. Mara met us at the gate, her eyes lighting up the moment she saw Keeper and Leo stride in, like seasoned partners in mischief. She knelt beside them, rubbing the shepherd's neck and murmuring, "You did it, old soul. You brought them home." Leo reached out and offered her a half-eaten cracker. She laughed, and for a second, the whole building felt lighter. "I want to hang his photo in the lobby," she said. "The one from the day you found them, only if you add the next one beside it," I said. "The day we all came back," she agreed. We left the photo that afternoon. 2 frames, one of the shepherds in the rain, one of the boys in the sun. As the weeks passed, routines deepened. Leo began stringing together words. Soft at first, then sure. He named the trees outside, the spoon in his bowl, the blanket he pulled over himself. And every morning, without fail, he'd crawl into my bed just before sunrise, whisper a sleepy keepa, and fall asleep nestled against the shepherd's ribs. The dog never moved, not once. He'd stay that way until Leo stirred again, and when he did, the first thing he reached for before the light, before the bottle, before even me, was the fur at his side. That was how he knew he was still safe, still chosen, still home. One morning, while hanging laundry in the backyard, I found a paw print in the soil near the tree line, smaller than Keeper's, lighter, a fox, maybe, or something else. But I stood there for a long time, just looking. And when I turned back toward the house, I caught a glimpse of something through the window. Not movement, not shadow, just light. Falling on the crib, falling on the dog, falling on the child. And in that light, everything was still, not paused, not stopped, held dot, as if time itself had curled beside us, and for a moment, just a moment, chose not to run ahead. That evening, I walked to the edge of the yard, the same place I had left the notes. I brought nothing this time, only myself, and I whispered into the wind. He's not waiting anymore. But if you are, you can rest now. No voice answered, only a hush, but it was enough. Inside the house, Leo had fallen asleep against the dog again, the two of them folded into one another like old pages in a beloved book. I stood at the doorway, watching. The candle still burned faintly on the mantel. The photograph hung above it now, and somewhere in the room, in the silence, in the breath, in the hum Leo made in his dreams, there was music I had never known I'd needed. Not a song, a promise. I whispered the last line to myself as I turned out the light. He's safe now. You can rest. And we did. All three of us, together.